Good morning, everyone. My name is Dani Picard, and I am delighted to be with you all here today, even if I am a little bit nervous for my very first sermon ever. So if I talk too fast at any point, feel free to raise your hand and go like this, and I will calm it down. I have been attending Belmead United Methodist Church since January of last year with my husband, Shane, and our daughter, Charlotte, who is 7, who some of you may know as Cece. You may remember me from the Wednesday night Lent reflection series where I talked about nearly drowning as a teenager when I went out surfing during a tropical storm. Clearly, I make great decisions in life. Apparently, that talk went really well because at the Easter extravaganza, Pastor Sam cornered me at the bounce house and said, "Hey, do you want to give a sermon while I'm on leave?" I had a moment of pure panic. Kind of like I'm having right now, but holding it together, hopefully pretty well. I thought to myself, she knows I'm new to this Methodist thing, right? As I said, I've only been here for about a year. And you also know, I was raised Catholic. I never believed that I would belong at the front of a church. Sure, as a former faculty member at Vanderbilt University, I have spoken in many locations to many different audiences, even on multiple continents, but this feels different. The lingering fear behind it all was simply, do I belong? Do I belong up here, holding this microphone, speaking to all of you? It'll probably come as no surprise then that question, do I belong, is the one I kept finding at the center of our reading today. What does it mean to belong somewhere, especially somewhere you've never been before? More so than that, I also wondered, what does it cost a community to genuinely open its gates to those who are new? Or in the case of our reading for today, those who have been systematically excluded. Today I want us to look at this reading through the lens of belonging and how the disciples healed a paralyzed man and brought him into a community. This sermon kicks off a 3-part series on what the disciples did after the Holy Spirit descended upon them at Pentecost. This series will look at how the disciples worshiped, how they healed, and how they cared for one another and for the community around them. Shelby McConnell and Chris O'Rear will carry this conversation forward over the next 2 weeks. Our reading for today comes from Acts chapter 3, and I want to start with the context of this reading so that you can better understand belonging in its historical context. I say that phrase a lot when I still teach at Vanderbilt. It's historical context. You see, I'm a historian by training, and so I so appreciate how Pastor Sam, how Steve, and Gracie always introduce us to the larger context of a reading so that we can see the differences between what life was like then and what life is like now. And not just the differences, but also the similarities. The context is important. In Acts chapter 3, we find Peter and John on an ordinary afternoon walking toward the temple for their afternoon prayer. It's their regular rhythm, nothing unusual about the day. Now, when I say temple, I want to pause and have you hold that word in your head for a moment, because you might be imagining something like this sanctuary or a chapel. A building set apart for worship. But the temple in Jerusalem was something else entirely. It was the center of everything. Religious life, yes, but also economic life, political life, civic life. It was where decisions were made, where power resided, and where the community understood itself to be most fully alive. To be inside the temple was to be inside the world that mattered. And this temple was enormous. The platform on which it sat covered 35 acres, larger than 26 football fields. At its entrances stood a series of great gates, and the one that Peter and John were approaching that afternoon was called the Beautiful Gates. Scholars still debate which exactly gate this was because the temple was completely destroyed by the Roman army about 40 years after this story takes place. Many scholars believe that the gate was made of Corinthian bronze, a resource prized more than silver or gold. In fact, scholars today have no idea what the recipe would have been for Corinthian bronze, but they do know it would have gleamed in the sunlight, glinted from a distance. Ancient stories also tell us that it stood taller than any other gate, possibly as tall as 75 feet. And for those of you who are also challenged with math, this is roughly the height of a 7-story building. It would have been 60 feet wide. It took 20 men to open the gate each morning. Standing in front of it, you would have had no doubt you were entering somewhere that mattered. This was not a side entrance. This was not a servant's door. This was a magnificent, visible, and highly trafficked threshold in Jerusalem. And at that gate, every single day, sat a man who was paralyzed since birth. For more than 40 years, he was carried there each morning by people whose names we are never told, placed at that threshold and left to beg by those who were passing through on their way inside. He had been doing this his whole life. He sat at the most beautiful gate in the city, at the very threshold of the place where life happened, and he had never once been inside. Peter and John have almost certainly walked past him before. It's believed that Jesus must have walked past him too. The people walking past this man every single day were not cruel people. They were on their way to worship God. They were devout, observant, sincere. They were also operating inside a system that had given them very clear instructions about who belonged inside and who did not. There was an ancient belief that your outer physical body revealed your inner moral character. Strong limbs meant a strong soul. A vigorous stride meant virtue and courage. And on the other hand, weak ankles, an inability to walk, and a body that had to be carried from place to place, these were read as signs of an inner deficiency, possibly even divine punishment. Certainly not a person who demanded full moral attention according to those cultural beliefs. The initial readers of this story would have immediately recognized all of these stereotypes and assumptions about strength and character. The man is described as entirely passive throughout the opening scene. He is carried, he is laid at the gate, he is raised up, he does not act, things happen to him. Our author Luke is invoking a whole cultural script about who this man was and what he deserved. The healing that ensued then would have been dramatic. It was not only a healing of the body, but a transformation of the soul, underscored in part by the movement from outside the gate to inside the temple. In every society and cultural space, we draw lines of belonging. The Bible often reflects religious traditions and how they drew lines. There are certain difficult passages that suggest that people who were blind or disabled had no place at the altar. Whether or not those traditions were formally enforced at the gate that afternoon, the man had clearly internalized his exclusion. He was not pressing forward. He was not demanding entrance or even appealing to anyone's conscience. He had positioned himself permanently at that threshold, asking only for coins, not for recognition, not for presence, just coins. He had calibrated his expectations to the minimum a person could ask of another person and still be asking at all. Let's take this exclusion a little bit further and think about physical spaces. We've discussed how cultural stereotypes can exclude, but physical spaces can too. Beautiful gates and temples are not built by accident. They are built by communities with a clear picture of who is expected and who is not. Take, for example, a building where there are only stairs to enter a space, no ramps or elevators. What is that building communicating about who belongs in that space? Certainly not people who are in wheelchairs or who cannot climb stairs. Possibly not people with certain heart conditions or lung conditions. I think too to the parents in the group who have multiple children who carry car seats into the space and how difficult that would be, including wrangling multiple wild children, which some of us, myself included, have. I have a colleague at Vanderbilt who studies how spaces exclude, and one of the things they've taught me is to pay attention to buildings and how there are stairs without ramps, pews without flexible seating, entrances that require you to go around back. None of these are neutral design choices. They are the accumulated residue of decisions about who matters, made so long ago that they've become invisible to the people they benefit. Let me give a more historical example. I'm a historian, as I told you, and I can't help but give a little bit of a history lesson. In 1990, a group of over 60 disability activists left their wheelchairs at the base of the US Capitol building, and they crawled up its 83 stone steps on their hands and knees. Among them was an 8-year-old girl named Jennifer Keelan Chaffins, who had cerebral palsy and pulled herself up every single step using only her arms. When someone asked if she needed help, she said, "I'll take all night if I need to." These activists were there to highlight how many spaces in the United States are inaccessible. Even the Capitol, a building that was meant to represent all in the United States, had no accessible entrance at that time. But let me be clear. The Capitol steps were not designed by people who hated the disabled. They were designed by people who simply did not think about them at all. That is how exclusion can so often work. Not through malice, but through an absence of imagination. Of course, exclusion can also happen because of malice and fear. It can be a deliberate outcome of systems designed to keep certain people permanently at the threshold. Consider how we draw the boundaries of our communities. Who gets to decide which neighborhoods speak together and which are separated? Which voices are drawn together and which are divided until they can no longer be heard? When people share common streets, common schools, common futures, and yet find the boundary lines around them have been arranged so that their community never quite constitutes a majority anywhere it could matter, we have to stop and ask ourselves, what is that? It is a gate. It just doesn't have a beautiful bronze door. It would be easy sitting here with all of this to feel the weight of how much has been built to exclude and to wonder what any of us can do about it. That weight feels heavy. It can make us feel powerless. It can make us reluctant to act. So I want to go back to Peter and John for a moment. But because before they ever reached the beautiful gate that afternoon, something had already happened to them that can help us decide what we can do today. Luke tells us in the chapter just before our reading in Acts chapter 2 that in the weeks following Pentecost, the disciples had been living a particular kind of life together. They devoted themselves to teaching, to fellowship, to breaking bread, and to prayer. They shared what they had with anyone who had a need. They met together every single day. Now, I want you to notice what Luke does not say. He does not say that they felt ready. He does not say that they had resolved all of their differences or that they had figured out exactly what they believed. He says they showed up. Day after day, they showed up for one another. And somewhere in that showing up, in that breaking of bread and sharing of resources and sitting together in prayer, something was being shaped within them. Not all at once, not with fanfare, but steadily in the way that water shapes stone. By the time Peter and John had reached the beautiful gate, they had been shaped by the Holy Spirit working through those ordinary habits into people capable of seeing a man that everyone else had learned to walk past. Peter did not arrive at that gate with a plan. He stopped. He looked straight at the man, not past him, not through him, and said, "Look at us." The man chose to look back. He reached out his hand. The man stood on his own feet, and then he leapt. The healing was not just done to him, it was done with him. Peter offered what he had in the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, and the man decided what to do with it. I want to end with a story that pulls us back about 6 years ago. It was the early morning hours of March 3rd, 2020, 2 days before the first Nashville COVID-19 case was announced. It was around 12:30 in the morning, and many of us living along I-40 were awoken by tornado sirens. I see some nods, as many of you remember this day. A supercell thunderstorm had spawned at least 10 tornadoes that had killed 24 people across multiple counties. My husband Shane and I rushed downstairs. I cradled my then 1-year-old daughter in my arms as the sirens blared and the winds howled. A tornado touched down about 3 miles from our house. Many areas of Nashville were heavily damaged, including the John Toon Airport in West Nashville, Bells Bend Park to the north of us, much of North Nashville, Germantown, and East Nashville. Numerous homes, churches, and apartment buildings sustained significant structural damage. Several large apartment buildings had their roofs torn off, as well as their upper walls. The tornado passed within a half-mile of the state capitol building downtown. In the wake of the storm, local organizations asked for volunteers and donations. What followed was a lesson in the difference between the generosity we want to give and the generosity that is actually needed. Well-meaning people across Middle Tennessee loaded their cars with bags full of clothes and drove them to donation points. But the organizations on the ground were overwhelmed. Volunteers who could have been clearing debris or tarping roofs spent hours sorting through garments that nobody had asked for, and storage space desperately needed for water and generators was consumed by clothing that couldn't and wouldn't be used. The National Emergency Operations Center had said clearly in a public statement on the very first day what was actually needed: cash to purchase exactly what was required, when it was required, skilled volunteers, and specific supplies like bleach, trash bags, and box cutters. But the message was drowned out by the impulse to give what was easy to give rather than what was truly needed. Many of the families most devastated by the storm didn't need a stranger's cast-off winter coat. They needed someone to help them navigate FEMA paperwork, or a contractor who could tarp their roof before the next rain, or simply a neighbor willing to sit with them in the rubble of what used to be their living room. They needed to be seen, they needed to be known, and to be restored, not supplied. This is the tension that is at the heart of Acts 3. The man at the gate called Beautiful had been carried to that same spot day after day to ask for money. Money was the obvious need, the surface need, the need that presented itself. Peter and John had none to give. What they offered instead changed everything. Not relief, but restoration. The man wasn't just healed in his legs, he was healed into community. He entered the temple, a place he had never been permitted to go, walking and leaping and praising God. For the first time in his life, he was inside the gate rather than outside it. The coin he had begged for all of those years would have kept him alive, sure. But what Peter gave him made him fully human again. When we respond to need with whatever is convenient for us to give, we can unintentionally make ourselves feel better while leaving the actual wound untouched. The clothing piled in those Nashville warehouses, those weren't given out of malice. It was given out of love. But love that doesn't stop to ask for what is truly needed can become a burden for those who are already suffering. In the weeks that follow the tornado, there was something else that happened that didn't make it to the headlines as easily. Because many of the homeowners in North Nashville didn't have insurance, because they were renters with no legal claim to stay, those properties began to change hands. 40% of the homes destroyed in that storm now belong to new owners. For many of the families who had lived in those neighborhoods for generations, Nashville is no longer home. The tornado didn't create that vulnerability. The tornado revealed it. The exclusion had been there all along, written into insurance systems, zoning laws, rental agreements, and political boundaries, invisible to those it didn't affect. The man at the beautiful gate had been there all along too, 40 years, every single day. The question Luke is asking us, the questions the disciples had been formed through all of that prayer and time and gathering, they'd been formed to answer, is not how did he get there? The question was, what will you do now that you see the man at the gate? Thank you.